Welcome to Cinemax Eye. Today, we're diving into the 2011 American horror flick Husk. Fair warning, spoilers ahead. The film kicks off with a creepy shot, a lone crow perched on a weathered sign reading Private Road. A black SUV cruises by, carrying 5 friends, Chris at the wheel, Johnny riding shotgun. They're chatting about summer plans while the others, Scott, Brian, and Natalie, nap in the back. Suddenly, a swarm of crows slams into the windshield. The SUV veers off the road and crashes into a cornfield. After the dust settles, everyone wakes up. Except Johnny. He's nowhere to be found. Scott checks his phone, but there's no signal. Chris spots a path through the corn and figures Johnny went that way. Meanwhile, Brian, who's dating Natalie, feels like Chris doesn't like him. He offers to run back to the gas station, but before he can, Scott notices an old farmhouse hidden beyond the corn. Thinking Johnny might be there, Scott and Brian decide to check it out. Back at the SUV, Chris and Natalie stay behind, waiting and smoking. Scott is gasping for air, struggling to keep up with Brian, who's far more fit. They exchange quiet words as they walk, but Brian starts to worry they might be heading the wrong way. As they push forward through the dense cornfield, they stumble upon an old, rusted mailbox and a long abandoned car half buried in the crops. Scott steps closer to an area of crushed corn and freezes. Something unnatural lies there, a dead creature, motionless. Brian inspects the car, but Scott suddenly calls out to him. The car's windshield is eerily coated in dead crows. But that's not all. Scott spots a scarecrow nailed to a wooden cross, looking sinister in the fading daylight. He climbs up to get a better view, but as he comes face to face with the scarecrow, he recoils from the awful stench. Through the haze of dread, he spots a distant house, its windows now glowing with an upstairs light. Back at the SUV, Chris is struggling to start the engine. Frustrated, he grabs a torch from the glove box, while Natalie, popping a few tablets, steps out. She notices a sign partially obscured by the corn and moves to read it. That's when she sees a small boy peeking from between the stalks. He bolts when she locks eyes with him. Meanwhile, Brian and Scott reach the house. Brian steps forward, hesitant, and knocks. The door creaks open, revealing an unsettling emptiness within. The door creaks open, and they step inside, looking around. The house is abandoned, cluttered, and eerie. A noise from upstairs breaks the silence. As the sun sets, Natalie walks down the road, scanning the corn for the boy. She stumbles upon a scarecrow lying on the ground. When she inspects it, she realizes it has human teeth. Horrified, she screams. Chris rushes over, trying to calm her. As she storms back to the SUV, Chris glances back at the disturbing figure. Natalie insists on finding Brian. Chris grabs the torch and follows her through the corn. Meanwhile, at the house, Brian and Scott ascend the stairs. Brian opens a door to reveal a room smeared with bloodstains. In the corner, someone is hunched over a sewing machine. It's Johnny. He's covered in blood, eyes glazed over, like a zombie. Nails are driven through his fingers as he sews a scarecrow mask from rough fabric. He pauses, holding the mask up in front of his face. Suddenly, he collapses onto the sewing machine, and the light bulb flickers out, plunging them into darkness. Natalie reaches the mailbox and car, but something rustles in the corn, making her uneasy. Shadows move around her, and something brushes past, cutting her with each swift pass. Panic sets in. Chris and Brian hear her scream and rush to help. Chris reaches her first, but before he can grab her, she's yanked away. He chases, but crashes into Brian. The sun is nearly gone. Scott stands alone outside the house. Night falls quickly. Brian and Chris discover Natalie, hanging upside down from a wooden cross, blood covering her. Brian frantically tries to reach her, but a rope around her feet pulls her higher. He searches for the source but finds nothing. Meanwhile, Chris hears faint whispers as Natalie's eyes start to glow ominously. Terrified, he sprints through the corn while Brian frantically cuts the ropes. Chris reaches the house and finds Scott. He tells him they're being hunted and need to leave. Brian picks up Natalie, running desperately through the corn, but something is chasing them. He stops in his tracks as a scarecrow, its form shifting, grabs the rope still attached to Natalie, dragging her away. Brian charges, knocking the scarecrow down, but it lies motionless, its body still as night. A second scarecrow slams into Brian, knocking him to the ground. It hovers over him, staring into his eyes for a few chilling seconds, then drags Natalie away. Brian winces in pain, his shoulder injured from the attack. He scrambles to his feet and rushes toward the house, meeting Scott outside. A scarecrow lunges at them but stops at the edge of the cornfield. Inside, Chris searches the house. Scott returns upstairs to the sewing room, only to find Johnny gone. Chris tells him they're surrounded by the cornfield. Scott insists on heading back to the SUV, but Chris is convinced they're trapped. Anger flares in Brian as he confronts Chris for abandoning Natalie. Looking out a window, Brian grabs a torch, and he and Scott leave. They walk through the clearing, when Scott spots a scarecrow lurking in the cornfield. Meanwhile, Chris continues his search of the house, inspecting old family photos hanging on the wall. He tries the telephone, but the line is dead. Outside, under the weather vane, Brian and Scott examine a row of abandoned cars, hoping one might be usable. They check for keys, but the cars are covered in cobwebs, their windows shattered. After a thorough search of the garage, the group discovers a Chevy under a tarp, in surprisingly good condition, but the keys are nowhere to be found. As they continue searching, Brian comes across a box containing rifle shells, while Scott notices something odd, a scarecrow resting on the workbench. When he gets closer to examine it, the scarecrow suddenly lunges at him. Brian quickly pulls him away, though he doesn't witness the attack himself. As Scott regains his composure, he appears to slip into a strange trance. The scene shifts to daylight, where he sees a farmer showing his son, Alex, how to slaughter a pig. Suddenly, the farmer turns and locks eyes with Scott, but instead of approaching him, he walks past and slaps his other son, Corey, ordering him to take over. Corey, visibly envious, stares at Alex. Brian shakes Scott out of his trance, and they move on. Meanwhile, Chris finds a set of car keys inside the house. But as he turns to leave, he notices a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, observing him. The figure bolts, and Chris, armed with a knife, pursues it. He climbs the stairs and locks himself inside the sewing room. As he fumbles for his lighter to see in the dark, the light in the room flickers on unexpectedly. Startled, Chris drops his lighter, and through the window, he spots someone entering the house. In a panic, he calls out to Brian and Scott for help. The door to the sewing room creaked open. It was Natalie, lifeless and blood-soaked, her expression hollow. She moved silently to the sewing machine and sat down. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind her, echoing through the house. Moments later, Brian and Scott returned. Scott called out for Chris, but the door refused to budge. It was locked from the inside. Inside the room, Natalie began driving nails into her fingers with terrifying calmness. Panic rising, Brian pounded on the door, shouting for Natalie as she started sewing with eerie focus. He raced downstairs, heart thundering, while Scott urged Chris to escape through the window and onto the narrow rooftop ledge. Chris opened the window and began to climb out, but as Natalie turned her gaze toward him, the window crashed down, crushing his fingers. He plummeted to the ground, unconscious. Brian returned with an axe and stormed upstairs, only to find the sewing room empty. Natalie had vanished. In a fury, he shouted her name. Below, Chris stirred awake, pain etched across his face. Brian and Scott surrounded him. Demanding answers, Brian asked where Natalie was. Chris whispered, "She's dead." Scott, trying to keep things calm, suggested quietly, "We need to leave now." Chris discovers the keys to the Chevy, but Brian refuses to leave without Natalie and snatches them away. Outside, Scott experiences another disturbing vision. Corey stands among the corn, silently urging him forward. Suddenly, it's daylight. Scott follows Corey toward a scarecrow, where Alex is inspecting it. Without warning, Corey stabs Alex repeatedly with a pitchfork. Snapping out of the vision, Scott finds himself in the cornfield. It's night. His legs are bound by rope, and he's hauled onto a wooden cross. He screams for Brian and Chris. A scarecrow approaches, brushing his face with nail-studded fingers, then slashes him. Brian arrives, swinging an axe, and takes down the scarecrow. They hurry back to the house. While Chris searches for first aid, Scott describes what he saw. As Brian readies himself, Chris urges them to flee, but Scott insists on staying. Together, they descend into the basement. As they search, Scott envisions a zombified figure lunging at him. Brian snaps him out of it. Then, they spot a corpse clutching a rifle. Brian grabs the weapon. Meanwhile, Chris hotwires the Chevy and speeds into the cornfield. Back in the garage, Brian collects ammunition. The vision ends with Chris crashing into a wooden cross, swallowed by the dark. The car refuses to start. A scarecrow lies sprawled across the bonnet, lifeless yet menacing. Chris struggles with the driver's door, it's jammed. He clambers over to the passenger seat, just as another scarecrow bursts through the window. He kicks it out in panic, but the one on the bonnet slams its head through the windshield, glass flying. Chris rips off its mask. It freezes, revealing Johnny's bloodied face beneath. In that moment, Brian appears, pulls Chris from the wreck, and tells him to run. He raises his rifle at the second scarecrow but hesitates, fearing it might be Natalie. As she steps closer, he pleads for a word, anything. Instead, it attacks, dragging him to the ground. Elsewhere, Scott is consumed by another vision. Its bright daylight filters through the corn. Corey walks silently into the sewing room, fashioning a scarecrow mask. The farmer questions him about his brother. Corey says nothing. Later, under a dimming sky, Corey places the mask on Alex's face and lifts him onto the wooden cross. Another scarecrow is born. Back in reality, Scott stands outside the house, dazed. Chris returns, breathless, recounting what he just survived. Scott listens, puzzled. Why weren't they attacked when they first entered the corn? A chilling thought strikes him. Maybe, while one is being turned into a scarecrow, the others are left untouched. Suddenly, Brian stumbles through the doorway, zombified, and heads straight for the sewing room. His movements are slow but deliberate. Chris mutters, "This has to end." Scott runs toward the garage to get fuel, while Chris crawls under the sewing machine to retrieve his lighter. Brian continues working, but then he stops. He turns his head, staring directly at Chris. Chris snatches the lighter and bolts. Brian resumes his sewing. Outside, Scott waits. Together, he and Chris sprint into the cornfield, splashing fuel behind them as they go. Reaching the Chevy, Chris frantically searches for the shotgun. The lights in the house flicker and die. Brian has finished. A scarecrow lunges from the dark. Scott stumbles back, but Chris finds the shotgun and blasts it away. They charge through the corn, firing as scarecrows emerge one by one. At the mailbox, they pause. The attacks suddenly stop. Silence. Then, Brian bursts from the house, relentless. Scott and Chris split up. He can't follow them both. Meet at the road, they agree. Chris turns and fires, but Brian barrels into him, slamming him onto a sharpened stick. It pierces clean through. Chris screams. Brian looms behind him, slashing violently. With one last effort, Chris rips off Brian's mask. Brian freezes, then collapses. Scott sprints through the cornfield, frantically pouring fuel behind him. His hands tremble as he flicks the lighter at sparks, but won't ignite. Suddenly, a scarecrow bursts from the stalks, seizing him. Rope wraps tight around his legs, and he's dragged backward through the dirt, kicking and screaming. Nearby, Chris is ambushed. The scarecrow raises its arm and slashes him with brutal force. Flashes of Corey's twisted vision flood Scott's mind. Corey stabbing Alex with a pitchfork. Desperate, Scott scans the ground and spots the same pitchfork. With a scream, he drives it into the scarecrow. It stumbles, but recovers, dragging Scott again through the corn. Just as it raises its arm, Chris tackles it, screaming at Scott to run. Scott hesitates, then watches in horror as the Scarecrow turns the pitchfork on Chris, driving it through him. Blood sprays. Chris goes limp. Scott escapes, breath ragged, and stumbles onto the road. A car approaches and stops near the wrecked SUV. He tries to call out, but his voice fails. Panic consumes him. A couple exits the vehicle, examining the damaged SUV. Between them and Scott, another Scarecrow silently emerges from the corn and lies down in the field like a trap set for prey. The man notices Scott lying motionless and cautiously walks toward him, unaware of the danger creeping behind. Scott struggles, but no sound escapes his throat. The screen fades to black. Like and subscribe for more terrifying stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss a scare. Thanks for watching.